we do this. As Steve mentioned, we do have a climate, we made a commitment to be carbon neutral by the year 2050. And that was about 2 years ago. Earlier this year, we adopted an updated climate action plan. So we now have a map to be, a very aggressive, ambitious carbon reduction map for how we can get to that carbon neutrality by 2050. And with the help of Jill Simmons and her team at OSE, we've laid out a number of steps, and we've actually assigned them to different departments on how we're going to get there. But this framework is within which we operate. When we look at energy consumption in Seattle, a little under a quarter of our energy is consumed in our buildings, both residential and commercial. Our carbon emissions, I'm sorry. I mentioned our electric utility is carbon neutral, so on a lot of the carbon counting, that doesn't even show up. But we also know that we need to be working on conservation on electric utility if we want to be doing things of converting our transportation fleet, for instance, to the electric grid. There's other carbon savings that happen there. But we spend a lot of time looking at what we're going to do in that building sector. We have an energy benchmarking program. I imagine other cities in the room, maybe show of hands, other cities that have energy benchmarking programs. San Francisco, Cleveland, Los Angeles. We've been doing this for, I think, 2 years. All commercial and multifamily buildings, 20,000 square feet or over, are required to report on an annual basis. Just got a report earlier this week that we're at 94% compliance, which is really outstanding. So that's the good pat on our back. Now, of course, the challenge is we have all this data. We haven't created the systems of how we're going to use that data to get folks to be making the smart investments, to have the incentives to be making the behavioral changes and types of things to turn around. But that's coming next. We have, talk about innovative financing a little bit. And how we charge for electricity. I understand a lot of folks had a chance to tour the Bullitt Center earlier this week. Opened almost a year ago. You probably know all this. Hoping to be the first commercial living building challenge building. I don't know when that certification will happen, but sometime in 2014 is the hope. And of course, the Bullitt Foundation, very mission driven to build a building like this, has the resources in the foundation to pay for it. But of course, building one building like this doesn't meet any of their goals. And so the idea is, how do they take a building like this, learn from that, and make it scalable and replicable? And one of the things that they came to the city about was said, we all know that the types of investments that we made in this building around energy are actually the smart, cost-effective investments to be making. I can sit down with anyone and show them the spreadsheet how to make that happen. The problem is, when you try to go out and get a building or construction loan to fund that, the banks don't know what to do with that energy savings. And the models they use to evaluate the profitability of a building will not allow this type of smart building to be built. So one thing we need to do is we need to figure out how to change the banks around that, and that's something that we can work on. But another thing we're trying right now is a partnership between Seattle City Light and the Bullitt Foundation, the Bullitt Center, on a new way for how we finance this. We're doing it in this building and a couple others I'll talk about in a second, but it's pay for performance. And how we traditionally have funded conservation at the city of Seattle is you install a piece of equipment, and we look at how that equipment will perform compared to some baseline, and based on our projections and modeling, we will cut you a check or give you a rebate on that. The problem, of course, is if you install that equipment and you don't run it efficiently, or you decommission it at some point, we don't know that we're getting the actual savings. And it also means we have to pick the equipment that we want to fund. The idea behind pay for performance is, we're going to tell the building, you show us how much energy you're using compared to a baseline, and we'll give you the rebate based on that. We really don't care how you get it, and we don't need to prescribe it. But of course, like Van Jones talked, it's much more complex in reality. There needs to be trust, there needs to be baseline, there needs to be modeling, and the city is working with Bullitt Center to do that on this project. There are 3 other projects we're working on citywide with some of our ESCOs, McKinstry, McDonald Miller, and I forget the third one on it, but also trying different models for how we can fund these, because getting these structural problems fixed is really critical for meeting some of our goals. Seattle had the first District 2030. I think there's at least 4 of them around the nation right now. Seattle was one of the recipients of the energy efficiency block grants during the federal stimulus package. And we did a lot of work through our Community Power Works program on commercial buildings, residential buildings, I'll talk about in a second. Seattle's District 2030 is really inheriting a lot of the work on the commercial sector. And the great thing I want to highlight about this program is this is a program that's driven from the private sector, from the business community. Downtown building owners and operators have come together, the progressive ones who recognize the savings to be made and say, we want to start sharing ideas, sharing best practices, using collective buying power to be more efficient. And we understand that it's in our best interest to make these investments, which is really great, and we're excited to see that expand. Talk a little bit about the residential side. I know this isn't something that Emerald Cities focuses a lot on, but it's been a great success. As part of our Community PowerWorks program, we spent a lot of energy trying to figure out how we could do, as Van Jones told me, create those good jobs, reduce energy costs, and reduce carbon emissions. And I'm proud to say that we just got a report back. The program's been going on for about 2.5 years, and we've done energy retrofits now in over 2,000 single-family homes, almost 3,000 residential units when you include multifamily. The average energy savings in those retrofits is 30%. And our pace for the last year has been slightly over 100 retrofits per month. And when we go back and talk to the contractors, this program was starting just as I started, and I sat in a room with the contractors. It was a small table about that size. Half the contractors around the table were not in the program because they thought it was going to fail, and they were talking about how the high road agreement and the commitment to hiring from certain job pools just wasn't going to work. And frankly, it didn't for a while, and we struggled with it. Jon Stewart on The Daily Show had a little laugh at Seattle's expense. But we were flexible enough that we could continue to revise the program, but sticking to those core values, not walking away from the community or the energy commitment. And now when I sit around the table, we have, I think, over 30 contractors involved in the program, stories of some of these folks that have been in the business for 20 years with 2 or 3 employees, now have 30 employees. It's really great. And we're now, of course, the federal money is going away in the next year. And so the challenge for us is how do we transition that from a city-funded program to a public-private partnership. But we have some folks on the ground that are working on that. We're using some expertise from Portland to help us too. HomeWise is a program operated out of the Office of Housing in the city of Seattle, focused on low-income housing. You know, one of the misconceptions I think we often have is that high-energy users are the people that live in the McMansions. Low-income folks aren't big energy users. But when we look at the data in our city, oftentimes low-income folks are living in older housing stock that's not very energy efficient. They don't have the resources to invest in energy efficiency, and oftentimes, even though they may live in small footprints, have really high energy consumption. And so this is a program we've been running at the city, working with low-income residents, both renters and owners, to figure out, make sure they have those resources, and if they qualify, we will do a full energy retrofit on the city for them. Workforce development. You know, I talked a little bit about Community PowerWorks, the high road agreement that we worked out there. We've worked with Emerald Cities and Got Green. I'm going to mention targeted local hiring amendment, but we've really done some, what I'm told, some pioneering work around project labor agreements, community workforce agreements. And so far to date, they've been, you know, a project by project, which has been great. But one of the things that has happened is each time we sit down and set the table with the folks engaged, we all mature a little bit. We know each other. Those relationships we can build on the next conversation. And while I'm really excited about the projects to date, it's what we can do at the next step that is really inspiring. I want to talk about targeted local hire, but I want to pull back for just a second because the challenges we face around income inequality in this country are devastating, and frankly, it's just it's unacceptable. And I always thought that a progressive city like Seattle was an anomaly, but when you look at the data, Seattle does just as poorly as the rest of the country when it comes to income inequality. And we're struggling right now with minimum wage issues and how to address that. And the thing that is particularly frustrating to me is if I could look at really bad leadership in the city and say that's why we got where we are, then we could just change the leadership. But the problem is, when I look at what we've been doing for the last 40 years, frankly, I'm really proud of it. And yet the results we're getting when it comes to equity are completely unacceptable. And so we have to figure out how we address this. And when I look at the challenges around energy and the mission of Emerald Cities and what the city of Seattle and so many other cities are trying to do, and what Van Jones instilled in me, talked to the audience that one day, we have these technical problems that we have to figure out. Which is the most efficient heat exchange, or do we use ground source or air source heat pump, and all that stuff, which is critical to figure out, and we have to work on that, and it's going to take a lot of energy. And we have these structural issues like how do we finance the buildings and the long-term investments, and overcoming the banking industry, really big challenges that have to be conquered. And I worry that if we end up focusing exclusively on those types of challenges, we will end up with some really beautiful buildings that we can point to, and really exciting programs and press conferences that elected officials like myself get to stand up. And when you step back and look at the numbers, the equality in our community will keep getting worse. And so it's critical that we're looking at issues around equity, racial equity, income equality. And we're very targeted and not lose sight of how we work on those issues while we're solving the technical issues, while we're also solving the structural issues. The targeted local hire program is something that's just getting started. The city council here unanimously passed a resolution supported by the mayor to work on a targeted local hire program. We're building on what we've learned from San Francisco and Los Angeles. We brought experts up from there to help us understand what has worked and what hasn't. And we are now convening a table with contractors, with labor organizers, and community members to figure out how, when we spend the hundreds of millions of dollars on construction projects every year in our city, that some of those jobs are going to people from the communities who need those good career paths. And how do we make sure that they are ready to take those jobs, have the training programs, so when the contractor calls up or opens up the list, there are plenty of applicants that can get in that. Don't know where that's going to go, but so far I've been really encouraged about where we are. And frankly, the work with organizations like Emerald Cities that help keep us focused, that frankly, at their boards and at their meetings, convene the players that have the power and the dynamics to actually change the outcomes. Because, we need elected officials for sure that are going to be good leaders and progressive and all that. But without community coming together and hashing through those details and working through the differences and presenting solutions to people like myself, we're never going to be able to solve that problem. And that's why the work that folks at Emerald Cities do is so critical. The last thing I just want to say before I wrap up here is the role that cities play. Hardly a day goes by that we're not reminded that if we're expecting Washington, D.C. to solve our problems, we're going to be disappointed. And the answer, I believe, and have believed for a while, lies in cities and what we can do. And it takes cities like Seattle and the other Emerald Cities, and frankly, hundreds of other cities, trying innovative approaches, trying new technologies, trying creative ways to engage community, and then convening and sharing our successes and also sharing our failures. And through that process and iteration and sharing, developing really robust models at the local level that I believe at some point will then filter up, and Washington, D.C. won't be able to say no to this, and we'll start to get some good progressive policy to address the challenges of climate change, to address the economic opportunities, to make sure that we're lifting folks up out of poverty. Climate change is something that's critically important to me, but I recognize that the only way we're going to succeed on that is if through this process we do elevate all communities, give them a chance to have a voice and lift themselves out of poverty so that they can engage in the challenge around climate change and be part of the solution. Because frankly, without them, there is no solution. Grateful for the work that Emerald Cities does. I'm sorry that Denise is sick, and I feel so bad that I hope she doesn't have a bitter attitude towards Seattle because of that. But when she was here 2 months ago, I had my first chance to meet with her. And so inspiring to sit down and listen to her vision and the work she's doing. And like when I walked out of that room where Van Jones spoke 6 years ago, I walked away from my conversation with Denise feeling so hopeful and optimistic that we have great, amazing people around the country working on solutions, and that all of us can make a little bit of a difference, and combined, we can really change these outcomes. So thank you all for the work you do.
If you have any questions for Mike, he's willing to take some. You're not going to be with us in the afternoon, are you?
I'm going to try to stick around for a little bit of
No,
that first
we
one.
can take her then. But got any questions for him based on what he said so far? Yeah, Carol.
Yeah, I was interested in this pay-for-performance idea, and I'm from California and work with the pushing the kind of models we're interested in with the Public Utilities Commission and the investor-owned utilities. And I noticed that the contractors you named happen to be strong signatory contractors. Is that a model that they really think is the best model? And do you also, I mean, is it a substitute for or an addition to some sort of pre-qualification and standards around apprenticeship, et cetera?
So as best I know, and I'll try to answer it. Steve, you can correct me if I miss anything, or anyone else from Seattle that knows. There's basically two different programs that are running. One is what the Bullitt Foundation is trying to do at the Bullitt Center. And they basically have said, hey, we have this building that's operating. You can write us a check for $170,000 for all the equipment, but we'd rather you keep that check and pay us based on performance. Not because they definitely needed a different financial outcome, but because we need to develop some new models and see if that works. Similarly, some of the ESCOs, McKinstry, McDonald, Miller, came to the city saying, hey, we want to try some new models too around, we look at these buildings, they're in them all the time, and they see and are frustrated by the failure to optimize what's working. And so they're looking for new financial models. And because we have a municipally owned utility where it's run by the mayor and the council, and the city council is also the regulatory body, we can try things that it's a little easier hurdle than going to the utility board. As far as your question on the signatory, the labor requirements around that, to date, that has not really been part of the conversation. But through the leadership of Emerald Cities, actually, we're just starting to engage Seattle City Light in a conversation and the broader contracting community about how do we make sure we take some of these programs, like what we're doing with Targeted Local Hire, like what we did with the High Road Agreement and Community Power Works, and make sure everywhere the city is making investments that we're really thinking about the career opportunities and where folks are coming in the apprenticeship programs. So that conversation is actually just starting. And again, I think we have a pretty good table in Seattle. We get most people get the values and are either truly committed to it, or at least they know that they have to speak publicly about being committed to it. But either way, we get them to the table, and as you work through those conversations, we'll run into hiccups, I'm sure. But I'm confident that we'll be able to have some solution we can share.
Yeah, you mentioned about possibly expanding the residential energy efficiency program and so forth, mentioning about 50%. There are technologies that are coming out very shortly that could probably bring it up to 60% and better. That being the case, would it make sense to try to develop a relationship, maybe through Emerald Cities here in Seattle, with the National Multifamily Housing Council, where you could take demonstration projects, let's say in the Seattle area, maybe link them up with other cities on the West Coast, and try to see if we could really achieve that maybe 60% and beyond, and really get to the point of really making some inroads. Does that make sense to you? The reason why I say that I know that the Center for Real Estate Development at the University of Seattle has relationships with that National Multi-Housing Council. So I'm wondering, would it make sense for your group and through the cities here to try to do an outreach and a connection there? What's your thoughts on that?
I would definitely be very interested in that. The 30% average we've done, Jill, what was the number that were actually over 50%? Do you remember? So over 200, about 10% actually exceeded 50%. But there's no doubt that we need to continue to go deeper. And the reality is we don't get to go into someone's home and do an energy retrofit every 3 years. So if we get one shot, if we're going to be a carbon neutral city, we need to get pretty close to 100. We need to be building, as Dennis Hayes likes to say, of the Bullitt building when we talk about our energy code. He's like, actually, every building should look like this going forward if you're really going to be carbon neutral by 2050. So I would love to follow up with you on what that collaboration looks like, and specifically the challenge around multifamily housing is one that we really struggle with. The HomeWise program has been successful because we essentially pay for the energy retrofit itself. But taking that to scale is not going to work, and we need new models where we can get that split incentive with the landowner and the tenant to figure out how we can solve that.
Yes, thank you so much for your comments. I'm a mayor of a small town in Georgia, just outside of the metro Atlanta area. And I was wondering what kind of collaboration does Seattle have, let's say, with other cities within the state of Washington? And is there any look at, sort of moving these ideas to a more regional basis beyond the city limits?
Great question. We rely a lot on some of the NGOs, in part to help convene us. So organizations like Climate Solutions or the CR Club that have a regional presence help bring us together. One of the other things, Seattle City Light is a city-owned electric utility, but it actually serves some of the surrounding cities. And so we're just expanding, next year we'll be expanding that conservation program to the smaller cities. But what we can do in Seattle, both because we have a very progressive electorate that supports these policies, and we're at the scale where we can hire a number of experts to work on different projects, and we own our own electric utility. It's a real challenge to try and figure out how some of the smaller jurisdictions that don't have the resources can do that. One of the things that we try to work very well with is when we come up with ideas, being very generous with our staff resources to provide kind of technical assistance to other cities and help them take programs. We do like to pat ourselves on our back a lot in Seattle, but we also like to, when we do find success, making sure we share it. One of the things that I think about all the time when I talk about climate change and how great Seattle can be, even if we're able to kind of flip some switch tomorrow and eliminate all of our carbon reductions, it wouldn't mean a thing in the global sense if things we're not doing here are not replicated in other cities. So we have to be doing a better job at having those conversations. And if you have suggestions from a smaller city to how big cities can play better, I would be very open to that. And I'm sure the neighboring cities of Seattle would be too.
I really appreciate your emphasis on equity because I think it's often an afterthought in a lot of public policies. As you engage in your climate action plan and you've assigned different bureaus to different pieces of that plan, is equity a deliverable that they're tasked with considering?
Yeah, so the city of Seattle has a program we call the Race and Social Justice Initiative. And it started under Mayor Greg Nichols. I think it's probably 8 or 10 years old as a named program. And the idea behind that program is that everyone in the city at any level has gone through some training and understands how to use different types of equity lenses in looking at policy decisions. Now, there are some departments in the city that do a much better job than others. I just heard the police chief say the other day that they are fully committed for every officer to be trained in RSGI and buy into it, which is one of the departments we've struggled a lot with. But yes, we do have, we try to use that filter. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes not. The city of Seattle has a Department of Neighborhoods, which does a whole host of things, a lot of community outreach work. And one of the things that we found historically is that the city of Seattle, we pride ourselves on having long processes for everything. That often involves traditional meeting rooms where everyone comes together and has conversations. And what we found is time and time again, the exact same people are coming to the room, making decisions for the whole community. And as our community has changed, as the face of Seattle has changed, those rooms weren't changing to keep up with it. And so we've gotten very specific. We actually use this kind of trusted advocate model. We call it our public outreach and engagement liaisons. And we've gone out and hired people from different communities. Oftentimes, Seattle, about 30% of the people in Seattle were born outside the country. So we have a large immigrant population here in our city. A lot of people whose English is not their first language. And so we're hiring these trusted advocates who speak the language, who know where the communities are actually already having conversations, and going out and making sure that they're engaging in that process and part of the solution. I'll just tell you really quickly, we had a great meeting probably about a year and a half ago A room a little bigger than this, but packed. There were probably 200 people in it. It was a survey on like land use decisions and where people want to raise their families, simultaneously being translated into 7 different languages. We had the instant polling devices, so as we asked questions, what type of house would you like to live in? Unfortunately, everyone wanted to live in a McMansion in the suburbs. That was a negative one. But that is the American dream. We've done a very good job of exporting that one. But asking people about energy conservation. Would you invest in energy conservation to save money, to make your home more comfortable, or because it's good for the environment? 70% of the people were like, because it's good for the environment. And I was blown away at first. And when I thought about it a bit, I think about as a Sierra Club, as someone white with privilege who's come up through the Sierra Club organization, the stories we elevate about, taking care of Mother Earth often come from traditional cultures, many of whom are now living in Seattle because they've been displaced. And of course, they were raised on the land. They understand what environmental degradation means firsthand, not like I do through a magazine. And so the commitment to what we talk about in these groups already exists in our communities in ways that's so much more powerful than probably I even have. And we just need to figure out how we can unleash that and make sure folks have the opportunity. Thank you all so much.
Okay. He's great, isn't he? Okay, and thanks for sticking